So where do we start? To start creating your narrative budget, you'll look over the list of expenditures from your financial budget and think about the types of ministries your congregation is involved in. Make a list of the categories and maybe start with a brief sentence to describe what each ministry area involves. Eventually, it'll be nice to add appropriate scripture to these ministry categories too. And then begin to assign each line of the financial budget to a ministry category by placing it in that appropriate area. Most cases, it will be very clear. If it is not, check with your clergy or staff because they'll probably know pretty quickly too. For clergy and staff salary and packages, begin by asking your clergy and staff to think about the work they do. How much time do they spend on these categories that you've chosen? The categories that we see most often are pastoral care, worship and music, outreach and mission, Christian formation, and church life. But you'll pick the ones that mean the most to you and work in your context, and pick the way that, word them the way that work best in your context as well. So to begin this, I will say, don't spend more than about 15 minutes on this, okay? I can tell you that the year that I was on the stewardship team at my home church and I helped with the narrative budget, I worked with our rector to figure out their time. As a small parish with one clergy person on staff, I didn't think it would be too hard, so I went through the budget and I came up with the percentages based on what I knew of the system, and I sent it to our rector for them to take a look. They weren't sure it was right, and I will agree I'm not the best when it comes to math. So they proceeded to do a deep dive into the budget, into their schedule, and spent nearly a week on this work. Their information was only different by 1%. I'm not telling you it wasn't a good exercise, but I'm telling you that my back of the envelope work is probably good enough for this. But it is good to remember to help your staff think beyond what happens when they sit and answer the phone in the office. Make sure that they consider their entire day and all of the days of the week, the length and the breadth of their work. Because when it comes to personnel, especially clergy, we're talking about more than what happens inside the office. We're talking about worship leadership, care for the sick, calling on the bereaved, representing your church in the community, teaching the gospel, and administrative support for the whole congregation. That salary and benefits package extends across a whole range of ministries and activities from which your church and community benefit. And a narrative budget helps to better tell that story. We can also acknowledge that there's obviously no typical week, and church work is seasonal. But start to think about what a week sort of looks like. And then you'll divide the compensation using the percentages, and you'll have a story that includes the impact of the work. And it'll begin to tell a story of the ministry that makes a difference in your community and for your congregation. So what about the building? No one joins your church to help you pay your bills. So let's tell a story of your church building. You have incredible ministries, some of them that you manage and some that others might manage. And of course, this year will be a little bit different. Unless you have a particularly large space that is contracted to a specific entity, I usually suggest that you take your building expenses and divide them roughly by the same amount that you've used to establish your ministry categories. I know it might seem weird this year since you may not be using your building space for most of the year in the same way you usually do, but many of your expenses will probably be less too. And if you don't have as many stories to tell about your building this year, I think that's okay, because you're going to have many, many other stories to tell because your ministries were in other places. They were outside your building. And some of them were even, through Zoom like this. And you will need to talk about them too. So where are you going to find this information? because there's more to a narrative budget than the work of your clergy and your staff. The narrative budget should reflect what happens all through your church and by everyone involved in your church. So for each ministry category, write down some examples of what happens because of that ministry. You may want to talk to the people involved in each of the programs too. Reach out to them, have them tell you their stories. How did this ministry area make a difference in their life? How did the ministry make a difference to the community? Including pictures is wonderful, just like we said, but be careful not to include pictures that you don't have permission to use. And I would suggest too, especially this year, pictures of empty church buildings will not be uplifting. As Julie has mentioned in previous webinars, right now is a great time to keep track of events and pictures so that you can come back to them later. Nothing is worse than trying to remember the thing with the thing so that you can include it months after you saw it. So start now. Create a file, and it will be much easier. The good news is you will come across wonderful stories that can be shared through your narrative budget. And these stories will shape the way you then look at your annual giving for your mission and your ministry.